Good morning.
Good morning.
By the end of this, you may think that I'm proposing to rename the German Marshall Fund the German MARTIAL Fund, but I'm not. What's going on in Ukraine, and what are its implications for the Caucasus and for the West? I understand that's my assignment, and let me address this. Seems to me we're seeing the implementation of Mr. Putin's, what shall we call it, dream, plan, fixation, namely to re-establish a single economic and security zone around Russia, dominated by Russia, and surrounded and including a privileged sphere of influence for Russia. In implementing this, Mr. Putin has taken massive, quiet, but important measures against Georgia, Azerbaijan, and other states, including the Baltic countries and Central Asia. I'll speak about this in a minute. But it is worth noting that the military phase of the implementation of this began not in Crimea, but in the Caucasus, specifically in Georgia in 2008. So what was the reaction of the West to phase one? Well, in Europe, individual countries quietly returned to the status quo vis-a-vis Moscow, but the EU as a whole at least devised its Eastern Partnership in response. This may be weak, but it is at least something. The US, however, responded to the armed assault on Georgia and theft of its territories with the reset with Moscow. So I would say that this offers an obvious thesis, namely, had the West responded more effectively to the events in Georgia, the Ukrainian crisis may not have occurred at all. But the problem goes deeper. Had the US and the EU responded in any serious way prior to 2008 to the so-called and misnamed frozen conflict issue, whether in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, or Karabakh, the Georgian invasion probably wouldn't have occurred. Where is Armenia in all this? It seems to me that for a long time, Armenia sought, commendably, it's a delicate task to maintain cordial relations both with Moscow and the West. In the end, though, it seems that it has had to choose basically between Karabakh and the West. And in September, it appears to have made such a choice. It chose Karabakh. The US has always tried to keep a door open to a solution to that problem from the side of Armenia. Now it doesn't seem that this is a real option for Washington anymore, in spite of the rather bizarre charade of the Vermont legislature the other day. Even Belarus has put up more resistance to Putin's projects than has Armenia. Azerbaijan, meanwhile, voted for the UN statement on Crimea, which so far has gone basically unnoticed and certainly unrewarded here in Washington. So where are we now? And by the way, I hope I'm wrong on Armenia. Perhaps it will find some way of reviving its European vista, but for now, that doesn't seem real. So where are we now? Well, we see Mr. Putin charging ahead with Ukraine and then with the Caucasus in his sights. Mr. Dugin, 2 days ago, announced that no, I'm quoting, no post-Soviet state will survive a conflict with Moscow with its borders intact. That's a subtle way of putting it, of course. And he also went on, in case you missed the point, say that Azerbaijan's territorial wholeness is in Russia's hands. Now, I know Dugin. In fact, I was his host here in Washington. I invited him to visit. And we spent an interesting week together, basically talking, chatting, walking, drinking beer. And actually, he has some, as an old believer, he has some very interesting views on Russia's internal organization. His views on Russia's place in the neighborhood and in the world are well known and obviously reflected in the two statements that I just read. The U.S. has largely ignored the larger dimensions of all this in Ukraine. We haven't paid attention to the fact that all over the region, people are reacting with alarm and fear. I was in Kazakhstan last week. I'm not going to report on conversations with people in high official positions, but the reality is that over and over, I was told by very senior people there that we know that the federalization project in Ukraine is really directed against us. That this is just a practice round for the real one, which is somehow to deal with the unresolved problem in Kazakhstan. Of course, Kazakhstan had no choice in the UN but to support the resolution, but to oppose the resolution and to support Mr. Putin's statement on the subject. Uzbekistan, meanwhile, has been told that it can't export its Chevrolet cars to Kazakhstan or the Eurasian Economic Union, which knocks out a big part of their market. They hope, however, to be able to fill that by meeting unmet domestic demand within Uzbekistan. But this was just one of many, many steps being taken around Central Asia to indicate that this is not just a matter of Ukraine. In response to all this, the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs, as early as last summer, had a meeting in Tashkent. It was a very important development between the two presidents. As you know, they haven't always been the most cordial buds. And they met and had a very productive meeting, at the end of which they announced that a strategic partnership between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And they went further. In their joint statements, they said that we, as the two most powerful states in the region, have a responsibility toward the region, that no major decisions regarding our region can be made without our participation and assent, and so forth. The U.S., so far as I know, has taken no notice of this extremely interesting and important development, which, by the way, was followed up by an exchange of investors from the two countries. It's taken no notice of this, but China did. Without alluding directly to these meetings, the Chinese president, a few weeks later, made a statement of unqualified support for sovereignty and territorial integrity in Central Asia. He didn't extend this to the Caucasus, but it's not out of the question that that would happen. Now, Meanwhile, Turkmenistan has been maneuvering hard, and indeed the Turkmen-Uzbek relationship is now the closest within Central Asia. Even Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which certainly have very weak hands to play, are exploring every conceivable avenue to hold off what they fear is the inevitable. Now, what are the external powers? I've mentioned China, which is in the process of working out a multi-billion dollar investment in Ukraine and in Crimean ports at the time all this blew up. It cannot be pleased with the externally engineered separatism. Turkey has shown its card when Mr. Erdogan made his first post-election trip abroad to Baku. Iran watched the Georgia invasion with deep concern, having opened prior to that a free visa regime in Georgia and direct flights to Tbilisi. Even though it continues to consider a Russian presence in the Caucasus to be preferable to a Western one, Iran is bound to place a caution flag on its relations with Moscow after these events. The U.S., we are told, or were told, is pivoting to Asia. But when it begins to understand what is happening in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, and Afghanistan, will it not want access to those regions, to the Caucasus, to Central Asia, to Afghanistan? And if it wants that access from the West, does it want to go via the Iranian route? I don't think so. That leaves the Caucasus as the chief transport corridor for any time, not just for military, but for other goods heading east by land, heading to India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia by land. I see a coming reset of U.S. relations both with Central Asia and also with Afghanistan and the Caucasus. I don't mean a wholesale and massive recommitment, but something much more substantial than the present policy of irresponsible flight masked by sweet rhetoric. Indeed, I would foresee the possibility of the U.S. launching something like a partnership arrangement with the countries that choose to be a part of it in the Caucasus, presumably Georgia and Azerbaijan, and maybe a similar or linked partnership arrangement with 5 or 6 countries in Central Asia. The U.S. is the only external major power that doesn't have a regularized consultative mechanism for the Caucasus and Central Asia. Well, you might ask, what can the U.S. really do? Here it is necessary to understand what Mr. Putin is up to. Yes, as some commentators have suggested, he's driven by classic old revanchism. Yes, as others have claimed, his aggression is fed by an atavistic fear of encirclement. And yes, as others have said, he's angry and opportunistic, and yes, he will ultimately damage or destroy Russia itself as he proceeds with all this. It's a program in which Russia's presumed security is attained, to quote Chip Bolin, at the price of the insecurity of everyone around it. Fine. Such generalizations about his strategic goals are important and interesting, but in the end, they say absolutely nothing about the tactics with which he hopes to achieve them. Here is the important part, and the answer is what are his tactics is stunningly simple, even though it has largely escaped the attention of commentators to date. Putin's tactics involve only one simple but very effective element, namely to seek out geopolitical vacuums, to promote vacuums where they are only nascent, and then to seek to fill them by military force if necessary. This is his program. This is his tactic. This has been at the core of this approach, filling vacuums, has been at the core of Russian expansionism since the time of Ivan III. Novgorod was weakening at the time he took it over. Ivan IV had exactly the same motive in knocking off a weakened Tatar Kazan. He had the same motive as he took on Poland and Lithuania in the West. It's the same motive that that Peter the Great had when he took on the Germans in the Baltic, the same motive that Catherine had when she seized Ukraine and Crimea from the Turks in the late 18th century. It's the same motive that Alexander I was impelled by when he took part of the Caucasus from Iran, and it's what Alexander II was up to when he basically walked over the three Emirates of Central Asia. Trotsky adopted the same method, the same tactics everywhere as he fought the Civil War. And, of course, this is what happened at the end of the war, both in Eastern Europe and in 1945, the Soviet invasion of Iran, of Iranian Azerbaijan. Now, if America or anyone else wishes to stop Putin, it must fill the vacuums or prevent them opening in the first place. This cannot be achieved simply through negotiations. It cannot be achieved either through deals with Putin over the heads of those really involved. It requires that, as we did under Democrats and Republicans before 2008, the U.S. affirm the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity in all its statements and actions about the Caucasus, about Central Asia, about the Baltic, about Eastern Europe. And then we have to act on this. Not just affirm it, but we must act on it. How to do so? Well, by strengthening local polities, by strengthening local economies, and by strengthening local security capacities. If we're unwilling to do this, we must accept the consequences. If we indicate clearly that we're willing to do this and then do it, the problem we now face will go away. But if we're unwilling to do this, we must stop fooling ourselves and accept the consequences. Thank you.